Morning. Yes, Lord. That's a new feature from Zoom. This meeting is being recorded. So, well, it's good to see you. Is about 5 minutes ago there were like 4 people in the room, and now we're full almost. So it's good to have you here. People coming in at the last moment here. We are beginning this week on Sunday morning with a Summer of David. We're going to be spending the next 8 weeks on David. We have found that people know something of David, but they don't know all of David. And so we're going to spend some time doing that. And one of the things I do want to encourage you to participate in, if you can and would, is that we are beginning tomorrow night, starting a study of David with Ryan Bonfilio from Emory School of Theology, Candler School of Theology at Emory. And he, along with Matt, are going to give primary leadership to the study, but all of our clergy will be involved in leaders of that. That's from 7 to 8:30. It's not too late to show up with that, but for the next 8 weeks. And our Tuesday morning, as well as our Wednesday night studies, then will be based on that and expanded upon, obviously, with the study with Ryan. So if you can do that, it'll be a great opportunity. We have a number of folks already signed up, and that would be a good thing for you to do. Today, I want us to spend a little bit of time just unpacking who David is to start with. So this first slide today is going to help us begin to introduce David to you, and we'll go through several things with that, and then we'll get into some background on 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is where we'll be spending a good bit of our time before we move into Kings later on in the study. But first of all, we if I were to ask you what you know about David, there's a lot of things that would come up. Many of you would first of all say that David's a shepherd boy. He was also an armor bearer and a musician for King Saul. And David then becomes the 3rd king in a line of kings for Israel, but is considered to be the most important. And he is the one that is the best known. He is the most frequently mentioned human being in the Old Testament. So if you read the Old Testament, David keeps coming up as example. Of course, in the volume of material there in these volumes or these books is very significant. And then he's still mentioned in the New Testament. He, other than Jesus Christ, is the other person in the New Testament that's most highly talked about in our scriptures. He also becomes the main character in 1st and 2nd Samuel, pretty much 1st and 2nd Kings too, but also 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Those are the 6 books in a row that we find. And so there's a lot of information about David and what he did and how he did it, both lifting him up and praising him, and also not doing such a great job with that and not talked very highly about. He's probably most commonly known, especially if you're a child, but even those of us who are adults, when we think of David, one of the first things we think of is David defeating the giant Goliath, the Philistine. And David was not very big in stature, is what we have been told about. But yet in the midst of that, he was able to conquer this great giant that was just running havoc with the Philistines through the area. David is going on to the next slide then. David is from the tribe of Judah. He descended from Jesse, Obed, and then Boaz and Ruth become his great-grandparents. He lived for 1,000 years, and he was from Bethlehem. Remember when we have the birth narrative about Jesus, and they say that everybody has to go back to their hometown. Joseph and family go back to Bethlehem, which is the city of David. And so we have that is an important part of him. David was also the king's or the God's anointed one. And he actually is anointed 3 different times in the scriptures, and we're going to hear about that. The first one is by Samuel. If you remember, Samuel is charged by God to find this new appointed king that he is having And so he goes to Jesse's house and he tries to see all the sons come forward. And if you remember, David is the only one that's not there, and he's kind of out keeping care of the sheep while everybody else there. He's the youngest, he's the smallest, and for that reason, he's not there immediately. And so Samuel comes and meets with Jesse and his sons, and he starts trying the glass slipper on to see if it'll fit. And it doesn't fit anybody. And he says, well, the Lord told me to come here. The new anointed king will come from this household. Where is there anybody else? And they said, well, we got this little guy out here. And so, of course, when he comes, he is then anointed initially by Samuel. Then those who are the leaders of the tribe of Judah anoint him, and then ultimately the elders of Israel anoint him as king. So over this period of time, he's kind of the king in waiting. He's been anointed. He knows he's going to be king, but yet we have to go through all the steps to get there related to Saul and his leadership and the turnover then of the kingdom. When he became king, David established Jerusalem as the nation's capital and also the earthly home of God. And it's David who wants to have Jerusalem as this place. He then begins to envision the temple, but God says, no, not yet. And so he doesn't get to do that. So it comes later with Solomon. We also know that David was a great warrior. Even though he was not big in stature, he was very wise and he was very strong, and he had learned how to protect the sheep and the goats when he was a shepherd. And so he was able to fend off those who would come, and that carried over then to, of course, when he was king. David's fame and popularity began to grow. And as he was working with King Saul called on him to help him get out of things. And we'll see a little bit more about Saul in a few minutes with that. But he became jealous of him, and he began to then pursue him. And David actually has to run for his life. And he spends a lot of time in En-Gedi, which is an oasis that's south of Jerusalem and south of Jericho, right off of the Dead Sea. And so he spends time there just trying so he's in the wilderness and he's in En-Gedi with that, just trying to avoid Saul with all the ways he can. David committed adultery, we know, with Bathsheba, and sought to have her husband Uriah killed, which he does ultimately do. And that becomes a sin upon him, that he took the life of this warrior. He put him in battle in a way that he would be overrun, and he was with that. But in the midst of all that, David was a man of God's own heart. He was faithful as he could be, but he also was human. And for that reason, he often fell short of what God called him and asked him to do. David wrote at least half or more of the Psalms. He's given credit for at least 73, and then there's a lot of folks who would give him credit for all of the Psalms. But a lot of those are the laments. A lot of the 73 that he is given credit for are laments about the ways that he has fallen short, that God is so wonderful, God is so great, but yet I am so human and I often fall short of that, and I have fallen short. And so I need to be repentant of those. I need to lament those things. So then we move into some information about 1st and 2nd Samuel. 1st and 2nd Samuel was written at the end of the period of Judges, which is around 1025 BC, and just before the death of King David is what it goes through, and that's in 961 BC. So David is king for about 40 years during that period of time. And first of all, if you remember, the tribes are kind of a loose organization. They have the 12 tribes, and they're kind of a loose organization. They have a leadership, but it's not really like other nations have kings. And so that's what becomes part of the problem for them. And we'll talk about that. The first of the 3 chapters recounts the birth of Samuel and his entry into the priestly service of God. If you remember, Samuel is a servant to Eli, And Samuel is called by God. And if you remember that, get up in the night and run and find out, yes, Lord, all of that. Finally, Samuel is understood to be a servant of God. And so he carries that throughout his life, from a small child all the way through, that he is a follower of God, and he is a priestly figure for the tribes of Israel. Samuel anoints Saul as king, as Israel's first king, in response to the pleas of the people. And that's what our scripture is on today. We'll talk about that. And Samuel transitions the people from tribes governed by judges who made decisions and made rulings on behalf of the tribes, but he does that and then moves them into a nation that's ruled by a king. And he does this reluctantly, which is what our scriptures are about today. Saul lacks military leadership to defeat the Philistines, and there was a lot of folks, a lot of other nations that are pouring in. If you remember, as Matt has told us in the last couple of weeks, Israel is very strategically situated between Europe, Asia, and Africa. There are more birds that migrate through Israel than any other place in the world, because you have birds coming from Europe, you have them coming from Asia, you have them coming from Egypt, and this is the pass-through. And it's the same for human beings. This was one of the major trade routes that you have in the world at this point in time, especially once the Roman government gets involved. In that whole area continues to be the place, the conduit for all the goods and services of the world come through there. And so because of that, it is a strategic place. It is the land of milk and honey for a lot of folks. And so you have all of these countries trying to take over this place. This is one of the places that has fertile land, especially around the Galilee in the northern part of the country, but it also has lots of resources. And so throughout history and time, Jerusalem of course, becomes the religious center of the world. And for that reason, throughout history and time, you have countries that continue and cultures that continue to try to take over this area. Jerusalem is the city that's been warred over more than any other city probably in the world throughout history and time. And so we have that happening here. But Saul lacks what we call the military leadership to defeat all of these warring groups. And this is when he calls on David, who's a strategist and who is a warrior. And he, becomes jealous of him, because all these people keep talking about, well, Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed tens of thousands. Isn't that great to be known for? I've killed tens of thousands of people, but David is known for that. And all the people, he almost becomes the glamour boy for the Israelites. And all of a sudden, the power begins to shift, and people begin to lift up David more than Saul. And Saul, because he has put David forward, becomes lesser and lesser of the figurehead that people want. And so for that reason, then in second, the Philistines ultimately, or Saul ultimately begins to pursue David, as I was talking before, and David begins to then hide from him. And so David goes into the wilderness. The Philistines continue to come in. Ultimately, they capture Saul and Jonathan. They kill them as a part of battle. They display their bodies as trophies, and then obviously the people find a way to care for them. But in 2 Samuel, King David becomes a great warrior, taking control of the entire region. And so David becomes the king when he does ultimately, and he really takes control of that area. In the Israel kingdom becomes the largest it will ever be in history during the time of David. David takes control of the region. He takes over in a way that then gives all the goods and services back to the people with that. And so even though David is a great king, we know that there's some personal things in his life that become problematic. David's a great king, but in the midst of that, his humanness gets in the way. He mishandles his sons, Ammon and Absalom. They begin to vie for leadership and role. As often happens when you're the king, people behind you and people all around you begin to take power. They try to put themselves in position, and this is often true of relatives, unfortunately. And so Absalom, in particular, is one that begins to fight against David. And David temporarily leaves Jerusalem. He leaves, there's a rebellion that's going on. Absalom's kind of in the middle of it. And so he abdicates his throne for a short time, but then he ultimately comes back to Jerusalem. And he regains the throne. He continues to have political problems, though, as well as personal ones, and questions about, he gets caught in this thing of, if my sons are already trying to take the throne, when I abdicate the throne, when I die, who's going to take the throne? Who's going to speak for God? Who is going to be the one that would come behind me? And we know all know now that Solomon is the one that does that. So David is very disappointed in himself. He's disappointed in the way that he has upheld God. And so for that reason, he, in an act of contrition, of remorse, of confession, he erects an altar for God there in Jerusalem. And it comes because of a specific incident where he counts does a census, and it's one of those things that's not what God wanted him to do. And so he repents from that. But this, interestingly, the site in which he does this altar becomes the place that becomes Jerusalem. It becomes the high holy place. It's the highest point that he could find in that area. And so for that reason, ultimately Solomon uses that as the holy place. It becomes a holy place because of what David has done. So basically, that's kind of brings us to the point of our scripture for today. I'm going to walk through this. You're familiar with the story, so we won't spend a whole lot of time on the details, but I think there's some things that are very important with this. Beginning in the 8th chapter, the 4th through the 20th verses. Then all of the elders of Jerusalem gathered together and came to Solomon at Ramah, and said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not follow in your ways." Now, these are two things that folks would say are pretty good reasons for these folks to say, maybe we need to begin to start thinking about some additional leadership here. You're getting up in years, and your sons are immoral. They are priests also, but they are not living up to what God would want and need, and you would want them to be. You know that they're inept, basically. They're immoral, they're in priestly roles, but because, a lot of times when people get control of things, when they become the leaders, sometimes the humanness gets in the way, and that's what's happened with these two sons. And so the people say, surely we've got to come up with a plan. And it looks like everybody around us, all the nations around us, have a king. So why don't we have a king? Wouldn't it make sense for us to have a king? And so the leaders come to Solomon or to Samuel and say, maybe this is something we ought to consider. Appoint for us then a king to govern us like other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to govern us." Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people and all that they have said to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." And that's one of the things Samuel is very despondent at this point in time, because he knows the people are against him. But God says, that's okay. It's really not against you. It's against me that they're saying these things and doing these things, because they see, again, what others have, and they're unhappy with me right now. So begin to listen to them. Give us a king to govern over us. Samuel prayed to the Lord. And so we knew that, and he rejected it. Just as they have done to me, from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods. So also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice. Only you shall solemnly warn them, and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So God is saying to them, okay, they say they want a king. So if they want a king, then begin to think about that. If that's really what they want, they've rejected me, they've rejected you. So if they want a king, let's begin to think about that. But before you just jump into it and give it to them, let's tell them about what really is going to happen if they have a king, based on what all these other nations have gone through. Let's tell them about what they can expect and anticipate will happen to them if they have a king. I'm providing all that they need right now, but if they want a king, let's tell them how it's going to be. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, these will be the ways the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to be to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some will plow the ground and reap his harvest to make his implements of war and the equipment up for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his couriers. He will take 1/10 of your grain in your vineyards and give it to his officials in his quarters. And so he's saying, okay, if you have a king, this is what's going to happen. All your sons are going to be conscripted into the army. And if they're not in the army, they're still going to work for the king. All your daughters are going to be taken away from you. They're going to be put into jobs throughout the kingdom. And so the king is going to take over all your resources. He's going to take everything that you have, and he's going to put it into use for his own good. So continue to think about that. And then he says he will take your male and female slaves. Not only will he take your children, but he's also going to take your servants and the best of your cattle and your donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in the day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves. But the Lord will not answer you in that day. So when it goes wrong, don't call me. I've given you everything that you need. I've given you everything that you could possibly want. And yet you say you want a king. So if you have a king, here's all the things that are going to happen. And when it goes bad, you're on your own. So Israel requests the king still. But the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. They said, no, but you are determined to have a king over us, so that we also may like other nations, and that our king will govern us and get us out before. And basically they're saying, even though, we realize all that, we're still willing to do it because right now we're on the verge of being overtaken by all these other nations. The Philistines are right on our doorstep. They are the ones that are just right next door already, and you have no plan. There's no plan for how we're going to get out of this. And so even though that this other stuff may be a possibility, the reality is we're going to take our chance on this because we see that as our only way out. It's our only way that we're going to survive. And so go before us and fight our battles. We think the king will do for us. And so with the right person in leadership, we're going to overcome this, and we're going to be on our own, and we'll be okay. Interesting how even hearing all that, sometimes we decide we still want what we think might be possibly maybe one day good for us instead of staying with God. So we're going to break up into our small groups now. We've got some questions that we will talk about here, but I think it's an interesting story that even though everybody around us has a king, so we want to have one, everybody around us is falling, but yet we want to take the chance ourselves. So let's go to our small groups. It looks like in here. So looks like